3 hours from Miami, the most powerful warship ever built floats off Venezuela's coast. Not because America was attacked, not because a rival crossed a red line, but because a great power uneasy with its own decline mistook closeness for danger and movement for strategy. The real question is not whether Washington can intimidate Caracas. It can overwhelmingly, effortlessly, almost automatically. The real question is why intimidation has become the chosen instrument at all. Why does the United States feel compelled to concentrate extraordinary military force against a state that poses no existential threat, commands no peer capabilities, and lacks the power to alter the global balance, while the only actor capable of ending American primacy observes from a different theater unchallenged? That question is not rhetorical, it is diagnostic. Because great powers do not reveal their priorities through speeches or strategy documents. They reveal them through deployment decisions, through where they send carriers, aircraft planners, and political attention. And those decisions tell us something deeply unsettling. If American leaders truly believed the central struggle of the 21st century was about preventing the rise of a peer competitor, then every major resource would be oriented toward that contest. There would be ruthless discipline. Peripheral issues would be managed, not militarized. Symbolic theaters would be deprioritized. Distraction would be treated as danger. Yet what we observe is the opposite. Overwhelming force is being marshaled not where the future balance of power will be decided, but where emotional memory, geographic proximity, and outdated doctrines still exert psychological pull. This is not strategic necessity. It is strategic reflex. The deeper question, then, is not about Venezuela at all. It is about how the United States currently understands power. Does American strategy still distinguish between what feels threatening and what actually determines outcomes? Or has the machinery of power begun to confuse motion with purpose, activity with strategy? When a superpower deploys force against a peripheral state, it signals insecurity, not confidence. Confident powers conserve strength. They choose battles with care. They tolerate ambiguity on the margins to preserve dominance at the center. Insecure powers, by contrast, seek reassurance through visible action. They respond to irritation as if it were danger. They overreact to symbolic challenges because symbols feel easier to control than structural realities. That is the uncomfortable possibility now confronting American strategy. The question beneath the question is this: has the United States begun to lose the ability to prioritize? Every empire reaches a moment when its commitments exceed its capacity for focus. At that moment, leaders stop asking what matters most and start asking what can we still control. The shift is subtle but fatal. Venezuela is controllable. It is close. It is weak. It can be coerced, pressured, and possibly reshaped. The true arena of competition, however, is not controllable in the same way. It is distant. It is structurally complex. It involves escalation risks, alliance, coordination, technological parity, and the possibility of catastrophic war. And so the temptation emerges: act decisively where success is likely and postpone confrontation where the stakes are higher and the outcomes uncertain. That temptation is the real threat to American power. Because history does not reward states for winning easy contests. It rewards them for preparing for the decisive one. The United States does not face a shortage of military capability. It faces a shortage of strategic selectivity. The question, therefore, is not whether Washington can project power into the Caribbean. It is whether doing so advances or quietly undermines the only objective that actually matters: preserving a favorable balance of power in the system that determines global order. If power is finite, then misallocation is not neutral, it is corrosive. Every deployment to a secondary theater is not merely an action, it is a subtraction. Every hour of leadership attention spent on symbolic dominance is an hour not spent on structural preparation. Every victory claimed on the margins risks masking deterioration at the core. So the real question sharpens further: is the United States still acting like a power that understands where history will be decided, or has it begun to behave like one trying to reassure itself that it still matters by winning battles that do not decide the war. That question exposes everything. The official narrative is polished, familiar, and deliberately comforting. Counter-narcotics, regional stability, restoring order to the Western Hemisphere. A vocabulary recycled from earlier eras, repackaged as strategic clarity. But beneath that language sits a fundamental illusion, one that has quietly guided American thinking far longer than most policymakers would admit. The illusion is this, that controlling one's near abroad automatically translates into global dominance. That belief once had structural logic behind it. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when industrial power, geography, and communication speed limited global reach, securing the immediate region was a prerequisite for projecting power outward. Great powers consolidated locally before expanding globally because they had no other choice. But that logic does not survive into the present system. What Washington is attempting today is not strategic continuity, it is strategic nostalgia. The revival of hemispheric doctrines assumes that the Western Hemisphere remains the decisive arena of power politics, that denying rivals' influence in Latin America meaningfully alters the global balance. It does not. This is where the illusion becomes dangerous. Power today is not decided by proximity. It is decided by structure, by where industrial capacity concentrates, where technological competition accelerates, where alliance networks either cohere or fracture, and where military escalation thresholds actually matter. None of those dynamics are centered in the Caribbean. They are centered in Asia. Yet the mainstream narrative treats regional control as if it were still a proxy for systemic dominance. It confuses geographic closeness with strategic weight. It mistakes emotional familiarity for relevance. This is not accidental. The illusion persists because it is psychologically reassuring. Latin America is intelligible to Washington in ways Asia is not. The asymmetry of power is comfortable. The risks are bounded. The probability of uncontrollable escalation feels low. Asia, by contrast, is structurally unsettling. Power is more evenly distributed. Escalation pathways are compressed. The margin for error is thin. Victory is uncertain, and defeat is catastrophic. So the system tells itself a story. It says that reasserting dominance in the hemisphere is preparation for global competition rather than a substitute for it. It frames peripheral enforcement as strategic groundwork rather than strategic avoidance. But this framing collapses under scrutiny. Near-abroad control only translates into global leverage when rivals are militarily contesting that space. That is not what is happening in Latin America. China is not building invasion forces there. Russia is not positioning expeditionary armies. Iran is not creating missile bastions. What they are doing is economic, diplomatic, and political engagement, offering alternatives to American centrality. That is competition, but it is not military encirclement. Responding to economic influence with military force is not strategy. It is category error. The illusion deepens when policymakers invoke historical precedent without adjusting for systemic change. They reference doctrines born in eras when the United States lacked global reach, when European empires posed immediate military threats, and when the Western Hemisphere was a meaningful battleground for great power rivalry. Those conditions no longer exist. The United States today is a global power not because it dominates its hemisphere, but because it shapes the rules, technologies, and security architectures of the most productive regions of the world economy. That influence is contested not in the Caribbean, but across Asia's industrial corridors, maritime choke points, and technological ecosystems. By clinging to hemispheric dominance as a proxy for global power, Washington is fighting the geography of the past against the structure of the present. The illusion also allows leaders to claim strategic decisiveness without confronting strategic trade-offs. Deploying force close to home feels efficient. It feels manageable. It feels like control. But control over a secondary theater does not compensate for erosion in a primary one. No amount of dominance in the Caribbean alters the fact that the future balance of power hinges elsewhere. This is the illusion's final danger. It converts activity into accomplishment. Carriers move, forces deploy, statements are issued, victory appears visible. Meanwhile, the arenas that determine long-term power shift quietly, structurally beyond the reach of symbolic enforcement. Breaking this illusion requires acknowledging something profoundly uncomfortable for a superpower: that not every challenge warrants a military response, and not every region deserves equal attention. Power is not demonstrated by presence everywhere. It is preserved by discipline, by knowing where not to act. Until that illusion is abandoned, the United States will continue mistaking motion for strategy, enforcement for foresight, and proximity for importance. And that mistake will be far more costly than any rival intervention in the Caribbean. Here is the mechanism that polite analysis avoids naming, because once it is named, the logic becomes unavoidable. Power is finite. Attention is finite. Strategic focus is finite. This is not a matter of opinion or ideology. It is a structural constraint that governs all great powers, regardless of ambition. A carrier strike group deployed to the Caribbean is not neutral. It does not exist in a vacuum. It is absent from another theater. Absence is the hidden currency of power politics. Every aircraft patrolling Venezuelan airspace is an aircraft not flying where deterrence failure would be irreversible. Every intelligence cell tracking regime stability is a cell, not wargaming high-intensity conflict. Every hour of presidential attention spent enforcing hemispheric symbolism is an hour not spent managing alliance credibility under nuclear shadow. This is the mechanism opportunity cost at the level of empire. Most public debate treats military power as additive, as if the United States can simply do more everywhere. But power does not accumulate that way. It disperses. And dispersion is precisely what weakens dominant states. The mistake is not that America deploys force. The mistake is where and why. Peripheral theaters offer psychological rewards. They feel controllable. They promise visible results. They allow leaders to demonstrate resolve without confronting existential risk. Core theaters, by contrast, offer none of that comfort. They are ambiguous. They are dangerous. They demand patience, restraint, and preparation rather than action. So systems under stress gravitate toward the periphery. That is not strategy. That is institutional bias. The deeper mechanism at work is not aggression. It is misallocation. Great power competition is not decided by how many assets a state possesses in total. It is decided by whether those assets are concentrated where marginal advantage still matters. Concentration creates leverage. Dispersion creates vulnerability. This is where the asymmetry emerges. Only one actor in the system benefits from American dispersion: China. China does not need to confront American power symmetrically. It does not need to match deployments, region for region, ship for ship, or base for base. It only needs to ensure that American attention fragments, because while American power is global, Chinese power is focused. China's strategic advantage is not raw strength. It is discipline. Beijing concentrates its military modernization, industrial policy, diplomatic capital, and technological investment around a single organizing objective: preventing hostile dominance along its maritime periphery and reshaping the balance of power in Asia. That objective does not change with headlines. It does not shift with domestic political cycles. It does not chase symbolic victories. It waits. When the United States disperses, China does not respond theatrically. It observes. Every American deployment to a secondary theater reduces the density of force available where escalation thresholds are tightest. Every diversion stretches logistics, readiness cycles, and political bandwidth. And, crucially, this mechanism operates silently. There is no dramatic collapse, no single moment of defeat. Instead, deterrence thins, response times lengthen, allies begin to hedge, adversaries begin to test. The erosion is incremental but cumulative. This is why empires rarely recognize their decline while it is happening. Nothing looks broken, everything still moves, the machinery still functions, but it functions inefficiently. The United States can still dominate Venezuela. That is precisely the problem. Dominance over weak states provides no information about readiness for confrontation with strong ones. It trains the system for the wrong fight, and systems train toward what they repeatedly practice. If the American military repeatedly practices coercion against inferior opponents, it optimizes for enforcement, not deterrence, for presence, not denial, for escalation control in permissive environments, not contested ones. Meanwhile, China practices something else entirely: denial strategies, attrition tolerance, escalation under ambiguity, and competition below the threshold of war. These are not interchangeable skill sets. The hidden mechanism, then, is not that America is losing power. It is that American power is being used inefficiently, expended where returns are symbolic, while underinvested where returns are decisive. China understands this perfectly. It does not need America to retreat. It only needs America to remain busy. Busy enforcing old doctrines, busy reacting to peripheral challenges, busy mistaking motion for strategy. That is how power shifts in the modern system, not through dramatic conquest, but through the quiet exploitation of misallocated attention. And once that mechanism is understood, the danger becomes obvious. The greatest threat to American primacy is not a rival's strength. It is America's willingness to exhaust itself where the future is not being decided. This is not conjecture. This is structure. Power politics follows patterns, not because leaders lack intelligence, but because systems impose constraints that punish misprioritization regardless of intent. Great powers do not decline because they stop winning battles. They decline because they misread which battles matter. The central structural failure is always the same: the inability to distinguish vital interests from symbolic ones. History is unambiguous on this point. The Roman Empire did not fall because it lost a single decisive war. It collapsed because it continued defending frontiers that no longer generated strategic advantage, pouring manpower and resources into peripheral borders, while its fiscal base and internal cohesion eroded. Rome mistook territorial familiarity for strategic necessity and paid for it in slow motion. The British Empire followed a similar trajectory. After the First World War, the strategic center of gravity shifted toward industrial-scale continental power. Yet Britain attempted to maintain a global imperial footprint designed for a previous era: naval patrols, colonial garrisons, symbolic commitments scattered across the map. By the time the true threat environment crystallized, Britain had already exhausted the capacity needed to sustain great power competition. The Soviet Union offers the most instructive parallel. It possessed vast military power, nuclear parity, and global reach. But instead of concentrating resources on the structural competition that mattered — economic modernization, technological parity, internal legitimacy — it dispersed power across peripheral theaters: Africa, Latin America, Afghanistan. The result was not defeat abroad, but collapse at home. The pattern is consistent across systems and centuries. Declining powers do not retreat instinctively. They overcommit defensively. They attempt to prove relevance by enforcing dominance where resistance is weakest, precisely because confrontation where stakes are highest feels too risky. This is not irrational behavior. It is structurally predictable behavior under stress. Peripheral theaters feel controllable. They reward action. They offer visible outcomes. Core theaters, by contrast, impose discipline. They demand restraint. They punish miscalculation disproportionately. So declining powers gravitate toward the former and away from the latter. This is the structural lens through which current behavior must be understood. The issue is not whether the United States can dominate Venezuela. It can. The issue is whether that dominance contributes meaningfully to the long-term balance of power. Historically, the answer is no. What feels close often feels important. But closeness is not a strategic variable, it is an emotional one. What decides outcomes is where systemic competition concentrates, not where memory and habit linger. In the contemporary system, that concentration is unmistakable. It is in Asia. Asia contains the world's largest industrial bases, its most contested maritime corridors, its fastest technological races, and its most volatile escalation dynamics. It is where alliance credibility, supply chains, and military denial capabilities intersect. It is where marginal shifts in capability can produce outsized strategic consequences. Latin America does not meet those criteria. This does not mean Latin America is irrelevant. It means it is not decisive. Realism demands hierarchy. Not every interest can be treated as equal. Not every challenge deserves military prioritization. When states abandon hierarchy, they abandon strategy. The structural danger emerges when symbolic theaters consume the attention required for decisive ones. This is why the historical analogies matter not as metaphors but as warnings encoded in structure. Rome did not fall because it lacked legions. Britain did not fall because it lacked ships. The Soviet Union did not fall because it lacked missiles. They fell because they failed to align resources with relevance. They defended what felt familiar while neglecting what shaped the future. The uncomfortable implication is that strength alone does not prevent decline. Misallocated strength accelerates it. And that is what makes the present moment dangerous, because the United States still possesses enormous power. But power deployed without strategic discrimination is not an asset, it is a liability. Structural realism does not ask whether a state can act. It asks whether action reinforces or erodes the balance that sustains primacy. In this light, the contrast becomes stark. Venezuela feels close. It triggers legacy doctrines. It invites enforcement. Asia feels distant. It requires coordination, patience, and acceptance of limits. History shows us which instinct leads to longevity and which leads to exhaustion. The lesson is not that great powers should retreat everywhere. It is that they must choose ruthlessly. Those that do not are not defeated by enemies. They are undone by structure. What follows are not predictions. They are structurally plausible futures, the kinds of outcomes that emerge, not from intent, but from incentive and constraint. In great power politics, the most dangerous scenarios are rarely dramatic. They are quiet, logical, and fully consistent with the choices already made. Scenario 1: Tactical victory, strategic erosion. In this scenario, Washington succeeds. The government in Venezuela collapses under pressure. A friendly regime is installed. Sanctions are lifted selectively. Headlines declare the restoration of hemispheric order. On the surface, this looks like proof of strength. But victory carries obligations. Stabilization follows intervention. Reconstruction follows collapse. Security assistance follows political fragility. Resources do not come home. They stay. Advisors remain. Aid flows. Military presence becomes semi-permanent. The operation metastasizes from enforcement into management. Meanwhile, nothing structural changes in the theater that actually matters. The Indo-Pacific remains under-resourced relative to its demands. Alliance coordination remains fragile. Deterrence remains stretched. America wins a contest that does not alter the global balance and pays for it with time, attention, and readiness. This is the most seductive outcome because it feels like success while quietly eroding strategic position. Scenario 2: Strategic failure without defeat. In the second scenario, the operation does not collapse, but it does not resolve. The regime survives. The pressure campaign stalls. Regional opposition hardens. Latin American states, even those uneasy with Caracas, recoil from visible militarization. Economic partnerships with external powers accelerate not as ideology, but as insurance. Washington expends credibility without securing compliance. This is not a dramatic failure. There is no rout, no humiliation. There is simply exhaustion. The United States demonstrates that it can deploy force but not translate it into durable outcomes. Signals intended to deter instead reinforce perceptions of overreach. The lesson drawn by observers is subtle, but damaging American power is still formidable but increasingly inefficient. This outcome corrodes deterrence not through loss but through diminishing returns. And in power politics, inefficiency invites testing. Scenario 3: The silent catastrophe. The third scenario is the most dangerous precisely because it unfolds elsewhere. While attention remains fixed in the Caribbean, a crisis emerges in the Western Pacific, perhaps over Taiwan. The timeline is compressed, signals are ambiguous, escalation moves faster than consensus. Assets exist, but they are mispositioned. Response options are constrained by distance readiness cycles and political hesitation. Deterrence fails not because the United States lacks power, but because power arrives late and thin. In this scenario, the consequences are not symbolic, they are systemic. Allies reassess, markets react, norms fracture. The balance of power shifts not through conquest, but through the realization that American guarantees are conditional on availability, and availability is no longer assured. This is the outcome China does not need to engineer directly. It only needs to wait for. Why any of these scenarios favor China? What unites these futures is not American weakness, it is American dispersion. China does not require a perfect outcome. It benefits from any outcome that absorbs U.S. attention away from the decisive theater. A prolonged occupation drains readiness. A stalled campaign drains credibility. A delayed response drains deterrence. Each path produces the same structural effect, reduced American concentration where escalation thresholds are tightest. China's advantage lies not in confrontation, but in patience. It concentrates effort. It limits commitments. It allows others to exhaust themselves, enforcing symbolic dominance. This is why the most dangerous scenario is not failure in Venezuela. It is success that locks the United States into a long-term distraction. The strategic constant across all scenarios, one variable remains fixed. Resources committed to peripheral theaters are resources unavailable for core ones. Time spent enforcing legacy doctrines is time not spent preparing for future conflict. None of these futures require incompetence. They require only continuity. That is what makes them realistic. The danger is not that Washington will choose the worst option. It is that every available option carries structural costs that favor a focused rival. And in a system defined by asymmetric discipline that is more than enough, empires don't collapse when enemies storm the gates, they collapse when they fight the wrong war with absolute confidence. If this analysis unsettled you, then stay with this channel, like, comment, and subscribe because power never disappears overnight. It leaks away quietly, and that is what we dissect here.